Have you ever wondered why the United States became a superpower of the world? Most people would probably say it's thanks to its powerful military, advanced technology, or its nuclear arsenal. And yes, those factors are indeed important. But there's another small secret. The US also owns another powerful weapon, even stronger than nuclear weapons. It's a system called the petrodollar, the oil dollar. You may have heard news about countries in BRICS cooperating to challenge the dollar, or launching de-dollarization efforts. But what do those things actually mean? What is the petrodollar? Why does it make the US so powerful? And why is it so controversial? So this video will help you understand everything you need to know about the petrodollar system. Part 1. What is the petrodollar? The term petrodollar is formed from petro, meaning oil, and dollar, meaning the US dollar. There's also the term petroyuan, which works similarly, but uses China's yuan currency. However, in this video, we will focus on the US dollar. The petrodollar is a system in which global oil transactions are carried out exclusively in US dollars. In other words, no matter which countries buy or sell oil, they must conduct the transaction in US. And to be clear, the petrodollar is not a separate currency. It is a transaction system. So how does this system work? Let's break it down. Step 1. An oil-rich country, such as Saudi Arabia, sells oil to other nations in US dollars, instead of using its own local currency, the rial. This system is the petrodollar. Step 1. Step 2. After Saudi Arabia receives those US dollars, they don't simply keep them in banks or use them only for themselves. Instead, they reinvest those dollars into US treasuries, bonds, and other American assets. As you know, when you buy bonds or treasuries, you're essentially lending money to the government, and the government will repay you both principal and interest. In this case, when Saudi Arabia buys US bonds and treasuries, it means they are lending money to the United States, helping the US access capital easily. Of course, in return, the US pays Saudi Arabia interest from those bonds and treasuries. This system is called petrodollar recycling. But why is it called recycling? Because every time oil is sold, the US dollars earned by oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia flow back into the US economy through investments, while other countries struggle to negotiate and compete to borrow money from wealthier nations or organizations like the IMF. The US, thanks to the petrodollar system, automatically receives funds every time oil is sold, like clockwork. Not only that, interest rates on US bonds are usually lower than borrowing costs from other nations, or from the IMF, meaning the US not only borrows automatically, but also borrows cheaply. You're probably wondering, why did the US create this system? How did the US convince other nations to accept it? And why would wealthy countries, like Saudi Arabia, agree to it? We'll explore that in the next part. Part 2. The history of the petrodollar system. To understand how the system was created, first, we need to look into its historical background. Before 1944, all currencies in the world were pegged to gold, a system known as the gold standard. This meant that to print more money, a country had to possess enough gold reserves. Without gold, they simply couldn't print money. But during World War II, most countries, especially in Europe, had used up nearly all of their gold reserves for the war and no longer had enough to back their currencies. At that time, the United States held about 70% of the world's gold supply. So in 1940, around 44 countries agreed to peg the value of their currencies to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself was pegged to America's gold reserves. This system was called the Bretton Woods system. Thus, the US dollar became the global currency, but was still backed by gold. This meant that to print more dollars, the US needed more gold, which was not easy at all. At the same time, the US was spending massively on the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and many other enormous expenses, which required a lot of money. But they could no longer maintain the gold standard. So in 1971, US President Richard Nixon decided to end the dollar's convertibility to gold. This event is known as the Nixon shock. As a result, the value of the US dollar became more unstable, forcing the US to find another way to maintain the global dominance of its currency. You can actually learn more about this topic in another video of mine, which talks about fiat money, closely related to this. The link is in the description. Now let's move on to the story in Saudi Arabia. In 1973, The political situation in the Middle East was extremely unstable, especially the Yom Kippur War between Israel and a coalition of Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria. In this war, Saudi Arabia and most Arab oil-producing countries supported Egypt and Syria, while the U.S. and Western nations sided with Israel. In response, Saudi Arabia led an oil embargo against the West, triggering a severe energy crisis, with oil prices skyrocketing. However, while the West struggled, the embargo also harmed Saudi Arabia's economy, because selling less oil meant reduced revenue. Moreover, Saudi Arabia still depended on technology and global markets from the U.S. Realizing the embargo was hurting both sides, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached a secret unofficial deal in 1974, commonly known as the Petrodollar Agreement. Because it was a secret agreement, there were no official statements from either government. The contents of the deal were simple. The U.S. committed to protecting and providing military support to Saudi Arabia. In return, Saudi Arabia had to sell its oil only in U.S. dollars. Yes, only in U.S. dollars. Not in their local currency, the rial. Not only that, Saudi Arabia also had to reinvest the U.S. dollars they earned from oil revenues back into the U.S. economy, mainly by investing in U.S. Treasury bonds, securities, and stocks. Simply put, when you buy government bonds, it means you are lending money to the government. So when Saudi Arabia buys U.S. bonds, it means they are lending money to the U.S. government. This is the cycle of petrodollar recycling. Why is this important? Because when those dollars are reinvested back into the U.S., Saudi Arabia and other oil-exporting nations are essentially lending the U.S. billions of dollars from their oil revenues. The U.S. government receives this massive inflow of capital, which allows it to invest heavily in the economy and its military. Thanks to this easy access to borrowed capital, the U.S. can not only maintain a powerful military presence in the Middle East, but also ensure a steady flow of money into its financial markets at home. This helps the U.S. maintain the dollar as the world's dominant currency. When Saudi Arabia agreed to this deal, other oil-rich countries quickly followed. Because at that time, only the United States was considered strong enough, both technologically and militarily, to support and protect them. By investing their petrodollars into American assets, these countries ensured the safety of their wealth, while also generating profit, since the U.S. economy at the time was the largest and fastest growing in the world. In short, the U.S. used the petrodollar system to reinforce the strength of the dollar and its global influence, while oil-exporting nations, especially Saudi Arabia, received military protection and economic stability. And now you may be wondering, how exactly the petrodollar helped the U.S. become a superpower of the world? Let's find out in the next section. Part 3. The importance of the petrodollar to the United States. As mentioned earlier, even before the petrodollar system existed, the U.S. dollar was already the most widely currency in the world. And the petrodollar system made the dollar even more valuable and more sought after than ever. Why is that? Because in daily life, you need oil in every sector, from transportation fuel to energy production and factory operations. Simply put, every country needs oil. And if they want to buy oil from an oil-rich nation like Saudi Arabia, they must have U.S. dollars. This drives up global demand for the dollar because every country needs it to buy oil. And the U.S. is the only country that can print that currency, which means the U.S. holds enormous influence over global oil trade and oil pricing. That is why whenever a nation possesses large oil reserves, the U.S. always pays close attention to them. The petrodollar recycling system also requires all these oil-rich nations to lend the money they earn from selling oil back to the United States. This provides the U.S. with massive capital to strengthen its military and economy, helping the country maintain its position as the world's most powerful nation, at least up until now. Finally, the U.S. can even weaponize the petrodollar system by imposing sanctions on countries that do not follow its rules, allowing the U.S. to maintain global influence. How does this work exactly? Let's find out in the next section. Part 4. Why the petrodollar system is controversial. Now that you understand how this system works, you might think there's quite a lot to discuss. And in fact, that's absolutely true. The first controversy is the world's dependence on the U.S. dollar. Oil-importing countries are forced to hold large reserves of dollars in order to buy oil. This makes them vulnerable when the value of the dollar fluctuates. Imagine this. A country has accumulated a huge amount of U.S. dollars, but then discovers that their value is dropping. That's why U.S. elections Federal Reserve interest rate decisions, and any economic or political events in the U.S. are closely watched by the whole world. The second controversy is America's control over global trade, because oil exporting countries reinvest their petrodollars into U.S. assets. Their economies become heavily tied to the U.S. economy. If the U.S. economy suffers, the value of their investments will fall as well. Furthermore, most global oil transactions are conducted in U.S. dollars, and those payments must pass through banks under U.S. oversight. So if your country is put on the OFAC blacklist, the U.S. can impose sanctions, making it difficult for your nation to send or receive payments in U.S. dollars. If you want me to explain sanctions in more detail, feel free to comment below. Interestingly, the petrodollar system actually has a downside for the U.S. itself. Sounds strange, right? The petrodollar system forces the United States to maintain a trade deficit to ensure there is always a large supply of dollars circulating globally. Here's why. When the U.S. exports goods to other countries, they sell products and receive U.S. dollars. But when the U.S. imports goods, they must pay U.S. dollars to other countries. For the petrodollar system to operate smoothly, the U.S. needs to import more than it exports, meaning it must send more dollars abroad than it brings in. This helps the U.S. dollar circulate widely across the world, making it easier for other countries to use it, especially to buy oil. This greatly benefits countries that need dollars for global trade. But for the U.S., it means accepting a permanent trade deficit because it buys more than it sells. Although petrodollar recycling allows the U.S. to receive automatic loans from oil revenue to offset that deficit. It also partly explains why the U.S. carries such enormous national debt. On the other hand, if the U.S. exported more than it imported, other countries would have to return dollars to the U.S., reducing the amount of dollars circulating globally. In that case, countries would struggle to maintain enough dollars to support global trade, especially to buy oil. If that ever happened, countries might begin searching for alternative currencies to replace the U.S. dollar. This will weaken the influence and dominance of the U.S. dollar. Therefore, the petrodollar system brings both benefits and costs to the U.S. But it seems Washington accepts it as a necessary price to maintain its influence in the global economy and politics. The higher the demand for the U.S. dollar, the greater the power the United States gains. And perhaps you're curious about the future of the petrodollar system, so let's move on to the next part. Part 4, the future of the petrodollar. You may be wondering whether the petrodollar system will last forever. The reality is that today, the petrodollar is facing many challenges. The first challenge comes from other nations. Recently, countries in the BRICS bloc, including Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and several others, have planned to trade oil using their own currencies instead of the U.S. dollar. For example, Saudi Arabia has discussed selling oil to China in its own rial, or China's yuan, a system referred to as the petro-yuan. As of 2020, Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich nations are still using the petrodollar system. The idea of the petro-yuan is still under discussion. However, countries like Russia and Iran have already begun selling oil in other currencies, such as the yuan and the euro. If this trend continues or succeeds, it could become a real threat to the petrodollar. The second challenge is the declining demand for oil. As the world gradually shifts toward renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power, demand for oil may decrease. As oil consumption drops, demand for the petrodollar will also decline, making it harder for the U.S. to maintain the dominant position of the dollar in sustaining global influence. Although the world still heavily depends on oil, and green energy sources cannot fully replace it. By the year 2020, no one can say for sure what will happen in the future. Even if the petrodollar system were abolished today, the United States would still likely maintain its global superpower status. That's because the U.S. dollar is not backed solely by the petrodollar system, but has already become deeply embedded in the global economy. However, losing the petrodollar would still cost the U.S. an important tool of influence, forcing it to adapt in order to maintain its dominance. If you want me to make more videos like this, please like and subscribe to Knowledge Station. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.